Welcome, friends. My name is Artur Rosman. I am the editor-in-chief of Church Life Journal here at the University of Notre Dame and the McGrath Institute. I'm also an associate research professor here. I'm honored to introduce Cyril Regan. Cyril is the Catherine F. Huisking Professor of Theology at Notre Dame. Born in Ireland, Dr. Regan received his PhD from Yale, where he also taught in the Department of Religious Studies before joining Notre Dame's Department of Theology in 1999. His work spans systematic theology, historical theology, and continental philosophy, and he is especially active in the intersection of theology and continental philosophy. He has done considerable work in 19th century theology and philosophy, postmodern thought, mysticism, Gnosticism, religion and literature, major Catholic figures such as Newman, Dillebach, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Benedict XVI, and on the doctrines of the Trinity and the last things. He will shortly complete two volumes dealing with the relationship between the Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar and Martin Heidegger. He will then turn to complete his Gnosticism in Modernity project with a volume on Gnosticism and German idealism, and a subsequent volume on Gnosticism and German and English Romanticism. Most recently, Cyril was announced as the recipient of this year's Ratzinger Prize. Congratulations. Nicknamed the Nobel of Theology, the Ratzinger Prize is awarded annually by the Vatican's Joseph Ratzinger Benedict XVI Foundation to scholars who have distinguished themselves with particular merit in the activity of publication and or scientific research. Professor Regan has argued that Deus Caritas Est is perhaps the greatest encyclical ever written because it makes clear that each individual, saint or sinner, is to be valued infinitely as a work of God, to whom God remains faithful, or to use your shorthand, each individual, whatever their circumstances, is to be infinitely valued as a gift. On a personal note, I might add that he has published more than 40 articles with Church Life Journal, and I'd like to thank him for championing its cause, which has been a particular gift to me and to countless others. And actually, I think he's been a gift to many of the people that I see here in the crowd. It's really wonderful. So you know what I'm talking about. So I won't drone on. Please join me in welcoming Professor Regan and thanking him for his many gifts to the Notre Dame community and the wider church.
Well, for once, I think I want to sound more nearly like John Milbank than Jean de Marion. That is, there's a gift exchange. I want to suggest that Artur is also a gift and is also a demiurge, insofar as it's very few people have had, I think, a career in which they've created something out of nothing. So I think Church Life Journal has been a one-man band. It most certainly has been a one-man creation. So I think that sort of is a gift. I've just simply slipped under the door of the gift. I'm probably going to bear heavily on your patience in this talk, not because I think the talk is incredibly complex, but it might sort of go a little bit on the long side. So before we start, just let me tell you as briefly as possible what it is, so that you have some kind of traction, and at least whatever else you're going to say about Regan after this talk, how disappointing it was, and how it was entirely marvelous, if not miraculous, that he was awarded the Ratzinger Prize, its fault will not be a fault of composition or logic. There is an argument. The argument is fairly simple. Newman does something in the idea of the university that is almost impossible for him: to say something profoundly stupid. He says that he cannot imagine a Catholic literature, though he does point to Shakespeare and suggests Alexander Pope, well, he's kind of Catholic, etc. But he wants to rule it out. We can understand he's under all kinds of pressure. But it is an immense and bewildering faux pas. The counterfactuals are endless. But what I want to do is I want to reconstruct him. And outside the pressure that looks like it's been exercised by creating this curriculum that is not supposed to lead Catholics astray, Newman says other things, which problematizes, interrogates, but does not dismiss Catholic imagination or Catholic literature. And that's second Newman. That is, if you like, Newman on the rebound. Newman returned to himself. He's the one I want to talk about. And the third thing I want to talk about is I want to try and make what he suggests in this, shall we say, Newman having repented, providing criteria wherein you can actually suggest this is Catholic and this is not Catholic. And for that purpose, I'm going to choose two authors who happen to be influenced by Newman. Both are Irish, both have an association with Newman House in Dublin, Hopkins and James Joyce. And I'm going to come to the controversial conclusion that James Joyce is not a Catholic author. Just about everything Newman wrote on any topic over the long span of a career is controversial in some way or other and engenders strong responses, whether of outrage or acclaim, frustration or elation, the emotion of being hard done by, or quiet vindication. The experience of reading Newman, either the idea at university or other texts, is rarely, if ever, however, that of disappointment, an experience in which enemies and friends of Newman alike feel deflated, where one side is deprived of their seething anger at a forensic and sophistical Newman, and the other loses the privilege of celebrating their hero who brings the opposition to grief. At first blush, one of the few exceptions to the above rule seems to be Newman's reflections in Appendix 3 of the Idea at University, in which, in the context of creating an English literary curriculum for the Catholic University, that is the common hope of Newman and the Irish Catholic bishops, the former Oxford Don, who's entered into something like a contract of mutual misunderstanding with the Catholic authorities, comes to pose the question of whether now and going forward there is such a thing as a Catholic literature. This is a brave and bold question, one that we should be grateful to Newman for asking. Yet, to an unusual extent, the analysis that parses the question seems to lack the usual Newman sharpness, and to use a 19th century word, used with respect to explorers and geographers, seems to me to be oddly circumliteral. That is, it hugs the shore of the peripheral and never cuts a swath inland towards the center. That Newman finally answers in the negative, even going so far as to suggest that Catholic literature is an oxymoron, seems at once to be of a piece with the general impression of squinting and crown what friends and enemies alike would think to be a pedestrian piece in which Newman's intellect, for once confounding difficulties with impossibility, which is something Newman almost never does, yields prematurely to making a judgment he did not need to make and is the worse for having made. Now, just how spectacularly bad the judgment is comes into view when one accounts for the following two considerations. First, that a critic with the brain of a tomtit or a fruit fly would be capable of coming up with a long list of counterfactuals from Newman's time and going forward. Hopkins, James Joyce, Graham Greene, Evan Wall, and a host of other Irish writers writing in the shadow of Joyce, such as John McGahern, Colm Tóibín, and others writing in the shadows of Hopkins, such as Seamus Heaney and John F. Dean, who's among us. And this is not to speak to the American representatives, the standards such as Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy, and somewhat lesser authors as J.R. Powers, and non-standards such as John Berryman, Robert Lowell, and perhaps even the divisive Cormac McCarthy, gifted with a Catholic vision of hell on earth, and whose language seems to move towards a condition of liturgy, even if an inverted and infernal one. Suffice it to say that the list is only getting started. More names can be added. Moreover, the looser the criteria, the more the population grows, and in due course might plausibly move towards getting state recognition after the manner of Vanuatu. The second and supporting consideration is that an irrepressible champion of Newman, such as Ian Carr, who will not hear a bad word about his hero or even admit a reservation, after speaking about Newman's denial of a Catholic English literature in the Catholic Revival in English literature, jauntily proceeds to speak deliberately and incisively about Hopkins, Belloc, Chesterton, Green, and Waugh as Catholic authors, and to make matters even more bizarre, puts Newman to the front of the list of the more than plausible counterfactuals. It is almost as if Kerr gives us a license not to take Newman seriously, maybe even to presume that Newman made a joke that we are all now in on. I want to move from this fairly hapless conclusion to an interrogation. The prospects then seem dim with regard to us taking anything positive from what Newman says about Catholic literature and the idea of university. Indeed, a closer reading of the offending appendix hardly improves the prospects of getting anything positive, and in all likelihood really makes matters worse. Yet this is where we should start, and in the process make things worse before we make them better. And make them better we will. For Newman's mistakes are not just anyone's mistakes. They are brilliant and telling mistakes. Mistakes which, if we pay attention to other things he says in the appendix and the other two appendices on literature that precede them, may in fact help us to restate the problem of Catholic imagination and perhaps even suggest criteria as to where we might find it. In any event, and more particularly, while we cannot redeem Newman's conclusions, we can be instructed by the reasons he does not provide as well as those he does provide, by problematizing the notion of Catholic literature. To get this analysis off the ground, first let us begin with the two hinged propositions in the appendix. Proposition 1. English literature is Protestant. And 2. Whether or not there were Catholic authors in the past, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and others, going forward, there will not be great Catholic authors. That is, authors of such literary excellence that they will admit of being made part of the canon. Since literature has standards internal to itself that will reject the diktats of Catholicism. Now, how are these propositions supposed to be related to each other? And there are at least two difficulties. The first, formal, albeit with a few qualifications, advances a historical thesis to the effect that as the English canon of literature evolved, it is Protestant, or at least has become such. The second, in contrast, is a statement of principle concerning the fundamental lack of fit between English literature, fated to insist upon its integrity, and Catholicism, equally fated to insist upon its own dogmatic truths. The second difficulty is material, or substantive. If Newman is doubtful about the prospects of a non-antagonistic relation between literature, worthy of the name, and Catholicism, why is he not equally worried about the prospects for a non-antagonistic relationship between Protestantism and literature? The question becomes urgent when one acknowledges that, historically speaking, it is Protestantism that has far more routinely held itself apart from culture, either presumptively because culture lacks moral seriousness, or that it functions as a temptation. Here Newman seems to have skirted the difficulty by being able to identify the majority of readers in the English canon as Protestant. He does not ask the question whether writers made it into the canon because or despite of the fact that their faith commitments were Protestant. But to remind, if Catholic beliefs get in the way of the integrity of literature, why don't Protestant beliefs get in the way of the integrity of literature, such that there can, in principle, be no Protestant literature either? The puzzle is twofold. How and why Protestantism does not interfere in the autonomy of literature in the way that Newman thinks Catholicism does, and doubtless will continue to do going forward. And does this putative lack of pressure or belief exercised by Protestant authors in the English canon mean perhaps maybe we've found a secret link between the two propositions? For it certainly looks as if Protestantism is functioning not as something positive that has gotten aligned with literature, again as something positive, as exercising, strengthening, and stretching the imagination, but as something negative or privative. That is, a set of ideas or stances that happen not to get in the way of literature being literature and maintaining its desired independence and integrity that is hallowed in modernity. I want to suggest that there are two lines of supposition that Newman does not adduce that may in fact be the key to understanding why he makes the judgments he made, and also might prove helpful for a deeper and sharper understanding of what we are referring to in this conference as Catholic imagination. The first of these is exogenous, that is, comes outside Newman. I'm thinking here more particularly that in his leisure domain towards English literature as Protestant, and having Milton, Southey, and Byron as exemplars, Newman shows himself open to the influence of the Romantic narrative of the coming to independence and integration of literature as grounded in the unfettered imagination. The second is internal to Newman's understanding of Protestantism that proved instrumental in his conversion almost a decade prior to his writing of the appendix. Just a little bit more about those 2 points. Regarding the first, this concerns the story that English Romanticism told itself about its origins as defender, executor, and chief exhibitor of the prerogatives of imagination and its freedom from tradition and religious confession. And more particularly, the Romantic story that Newman plausibly buys into has to do with Milton, the arch Protestant, setting the terms for later English literature, especially poetry, in articulating a poetic code confident with regard to creativity and insistent upon freedom, even if or as a committed Calvinist. He could be cast as retarding what he opened by his commitment to Protestant beliefs about the absolute sovereignty of God, election, justification by faith, and the wrath of God. By claiming his poem to Paradise Lost not only to have outbid all prior epics with regard to scale and importance of poetic theme, but also, far more bravely, to have supplemented Scripture in his rendering of the fall of the angels as a supposition of both the creation and fall of human beings. Milton opens up the prospect of human creativity being taken as the substitute for divine creativity, indeed supplanting it altogether. Even if all romantics are not equally assertive concerning Newman's role in their release into a creativity that is not answerable to a pre-given religious and ethical norm, still it is quite evident that some of the more important romantics suppose Milton made possible what their age made necessary, that is, the jettisoning of the cargo of Protestant beliefs deemed accidental to poetic construction and judged to have delayed the proper self-understanding of the poet as instantiating a creativity coextensive human desire for expressing all that is true and beautiful, but also thereby contributing to the formation of elevated souls and authentic human communities. Shelley provides one of the best examples. In prose as well as poetry, in pamphlets on art and creativity as well as lyric poems like Ode to the West Wind, Skylark, Mont Blanc, he relentlessly argues and illustrates a form of divine human creativity that is not trammeled by superstition, servility, and rule. In his verse drama Prometheus Unbound, filling in the gaps by the loss of the Aeschylus cycle dramatized in the reconciliation of Zeus and Prometheus, he images a human creativity taking the place of a divine creativity marked by arbitrary rule and psychologically riven by hate and vengeance. Of course, as the play can be understood as a kind of divine cathexis, in which the divine comes to recognize just how vacuous the divine really is. It can also be understood as Milton, as a comment on Milton, wising up to what his true commitments are. And they are certainly not a commitment to the wrathful and self-justifying God of Calvinist belief. Now, Shelley is tantalizingly indirect in evoking Milton in the process whereby the creativity of God the sovereign yields to the more expansive and humane creativity of human beings. Milton's unshackling himself from his Calvinist beliefs is the very subject of what arguably is the greatest of all of William Blake's poems. Coincident with the purification of creativity that the divine Urizen undergoes, Milton also undergoes the same process of dispatching the qualities of caprice, legislation, and vindictiveness that distort his own creativity. Of Blake in general, and the poem Milton in particular, we can with a significant measure of confidence say Newman knew nothing. Yet Newman did know something of Coleridge, had read a number of his texts, certainly aids to reflection, the treatise on method, and had found congenial Coleridge's confession of having a disposition towards the other world, and his view of conscience as opening up the divine. Still, as far as I'm aware, there is no mention of Coleridge in the appendix, though it's difficult to think, given the subject matter regarding the history of English literature, that the table had not been said by Coleridge in the Biographia Literaria, in which Coleridge had plotted the lines of modern English literature from Shakespeare to Wordsworth, or from Milton to Wordsworth, who succeeded in the lyrical ballads, according to Coleridge, as liberating the productive imagination that represents an echo in time and under the condition of finitude of the infinite I am. Newman famously affirms the imagination in the Apologia, and in a certain sense, his notion of the illative sense in the Grammar of Assent pays homage to it. Faced, however, with Coleridge's actual claim, doubtless Newman would have found it exorbitant. Even if Coleridge keeps the analogical structure between creature and creator officially intact, it seems evident that defined as productive rather than reproductive, imagination will not brook any pre-given content, religious or otherwise. To sum up, when Newman spoke of English literature being Protestant, he has to be supposing at the very least the romantic account of the English canon that is motored by Protestant principles of autonomy that over time successfully dislodge as inessential those inherited Protestant beliefs that derogate from the status of human beings and downplay their potential as capax infinity. This is the exogenous or externalist reason for thinking that Protestantism, in a way, capacitated the dislodging of its particular beliefs embodied in literature, and would in due course yield to a literature in which the values are entirely aesthetic and internal to the work of art as entirely a work of imagination. As suggested already, Newman's own view regarding the trajectory of Protestantism in the modern world also comes into play in his sketch of the history of English literature. Newman saw that Protestantism had undergone profound changes from the time of Elizabeth and Cranmer, and given the emphasis on private judgment, was capacitated to do so. It did so on two overlapping tracks. On one track, the rationalist track, Protestantism underwent a filtering in which private judgment was ensconced as pivotal, and doctrines such as predestination, justification by faith, wrath of God, and a host of others could be sanitized or set aside. This seemed to receive both wide and vivid expression in the Augustan age for poets, with their moralism and their interest in the role of directing manners and ennobling society. On another track, the more evangelical track that received its apogee in the writings and preaching of the Wesley brothers, doctrines were also, to an extent, set aside, even though not with the same level of prejudice as illustrated in and by the rational camp. So what is crucial now was no longer the doctrines themselves and the possible shaping function than the experience itself. Personal experience, whether expressed in judgment or feeling, became self-authenticating. In the latter case, that is, in the affective case, the effects were felt in 18th century literature, with perhaps the Wunderkind and romantic favorite Thomas Chatterton the main example. The doctrinal cargo of Protestantism had become sufficiently light to be borne without compromise to the autonomy and integrity of literature that increasingly was deemed essential for the ascription of literary greatness and acceptance into the canon. And throughout Newman's career, but especially in the Apologia, he made plain his opposition to both stains, both of which shifted the center of gravity from the divine as transcendent object of worship to the self-certifying of human reason or experience. Obviously, the internalist and externalist constructions of the unfolding of Protestantism are mutually supporting. They illustrate how and why it is that Protestantism could sponsor the independence of literature rather than Catholicism. This can be assumed to be the background of Newman's underscoring of how, in contrast, Catholicism has no such history, and thus in Catholic literature, confessional beliefs could, and necessarily would have to count. Thus, the insistence that the Catholic literature, or one might say Catholic imagination, would have to be dogmatically inflected, which, of course, Newman realizes entails the destruction of the integrity of literature. It is hard to cavil with Newman, but he has, in fact, misstated the issue, even on his own terms. To use a more technical language, he tells us in Appendix 2, which concerns literature more broadly, that great literature is an irreducible personal exercise or inflection in language. To use the more technical language he forges later in the grammar, he is pointing to the writer as exercising his or her own irreducible and irreplaceable illative sense, which is the ability to make informed judgments on the fly, as it were, without appealing to rule. This obviously bears on the issue of whether a Catholic writer, as a writer, would be dogmatic in the strict sense. That is, defend in and through writing determinate Catholic beliefs. This surely would be the work of the magisterium, perhaps the Catholic theologian or the controversialist. To be a writer is not necessarily to deny that one has beliefs, but one's beliefs or assumptions now operate in a horizon in which they are not argued, but rendered, dramatized, and put under pressure to be experientially and linguistically persuasive. One can be assisted by a distinction Newman makes between religion and theology earlier in the development of doctrine. In contrast with theology, religion is the response of the person to the truths of faith that form an ethos and that shape and inform decisions in life. Religion has determinacy and shape, yet it is neither explicitly theological nor dogmatic. Religion operates largely through images, metaphors, characters, and narrative. The question to be asked is not whether literature and dogma go together, but whether literature can be religiously weight-bearing in a significant way. If we're allowed this emendation that has proceeded on Newmanian grounds, then going forward at least, there's no reason to deny the prospect to Catholicism as long as the integrity of literature is preserved by avoiding the devolution into didacticism and harangue. It is by means of this correction that's internal to Newman's thought that we can move towards something like a criterion for Catholic literature and Catholic poetry in particular. To state it more bluntly, perhaps, than I ought, for a literature or poetry to be Catholic, it requires that the symbols, metaphors, and narratives have a relatively saturating effect on the poetry or prose, that is, its basic linguistic form. Catholicism is a mode of seeing the world and parsing and squaring up to its contradictions. Belief can be suspended, problematized. One can spend an enormous amount of time attending to gaps in understanding and feeling. But beliefs cannot be absolutely denied. Its displacement and replacement by the secular can be contemplated, even made thematic, but never sanctioned. An agonized displacement, that is, the feeling that the time for Catholicism is up, that still probably means you're still in the game. An agonized displacement or feeling of displacement and replacement, that you're no longer with the zeitgeist. This is a liminal element with respect to Catholicism. I want to test this newly minted Newmanian perspective with a view to seeing how it works regarding two authors who typically we have no problem calling Catholic. Jared Manny Hopkins and James Joyce, both of whom are indebted to Newman. In the former case, Newman being essentially the reason for his conversion, and in the latter case, an elective affinity when it comes to prose style. Both also were occupants of Newman House, where Newman stayed when he was giving the lectures that made up the idea of the university, though not obviously at that time. I want to argue the following. First, that it would be difficult to come upon a more Catholically saturated writer than Hopkins. Obviously, he's going to pass the test, but with flying colors. Indeed, that the Catholic saturation is such, despite the late sonnets that represent Hopkins dealing with his own despair, that Hopkins's poetry plausibly represents a kind of limit as to what literature can religiously bear. Second, the contrary-wise, I will argue that according to these newly minted criterion or criteria, James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is not a Catholic text, but a belated Romantic text in which Catholicism serves as a symbolic narrative husk of a perfection only realized in the derangements and epiphanies provided by the secular world. Hopkins. I take it that only the truly unserious would deny that Hopkins is a Catholic poet, and more particularly, that his poetry is thoroughly and insistently incarnational. With respect to this point, we could offer a bundle made up of the following poems as evidence: God's grandeur, spring, the windharper, pied beauty, harangue the harvest, and kingfishers as kingfishers catch fire. It should be noted first that in Hopkins, incarnation differs from Parnassians such as Bridges in being more nearly performative than thematic. You perform the incarnation, you don't talk about it. It should also be noted, secondly, that Hopkins's notion of the incarnation differs from that of high romantics such as Wordsworth and Shelley, in that the divine power that suffuses this physical world is not vague and impersonal, and indicative of our own greatness, as well as the implicit greatness of nature, but signifies, rather, the person and energy of Christ, who ties together the world of unique particulars in all of their irreplaceable uniqueness and integrity. Indeed, one can see a profound pushback against a romantic ideology, in which, even if the incarnation of Christ is not dismissed, it is transposed into a more general idiom in which Christ is a possible element, a vocabulary element of incarnation, but Christ does not supply the grammar of incarnation. Perhaps this aspect of Hopkins's poetry, what we might call, following Derrida, the restricted economy of incarnation, as opposed to the general economy of incarnation represented by the Romantics, is most successfully captured in God's grandeur and the Windhover. Hopkins's determinate frame for epiphany and theophany is presented in the opening lines of God's grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out, like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. With respect to incarnation, in these opening lines, Hopkins manages at once to be thematic and performative. That is, the very imagery in which his general view of the world is couched, that is, the imagery of flame out, shining with shook foil, ooze of oil, performs that of which it speaks or signifies. And as he does so, he suggests and moves beyond Parnassianism, but also beyond high Romanticism, where the merging of the thematic and the performative did happen, though it tended to be more or less exceptional. Still, superficially, it is not evident from the outset that Hopkins has distanced himself from the best examples in high Romanticism of unity of theme and performance of worldview. For instance, the opening lines of Mont Blanc, in which Shelley expounds his view of spirit as the river Arve tumbling down the mountain. There is in that poem the concreteness of image that renders the worldview. Moreover, in the ecstatic mode to what we find in Hopkins, there is a surcharge or sublime energy that excites and incites participation. Yet even with Mont Blanc as the measure of what can be achieved in high Romanticism, the differences impress themselves. In the term grandeur, the poem obviously recalls the psalmist singing the glory of God that shines through nature as well as on Mount Sinai and in the Holy of Holies, and which in Christian reading might be associated with Christ. But even more directly, grandeur, or the greatest, is an expression of Christos, Christ our King. Again, the addition of crushed to ooze of oil, seems to evoke Christ who is crushed for our sake, and oil is obviously sacramental, and most likely evokes the oil of baptism and the entrance into the living Christ. The commitment to determine the particulars, an orientation towards persons rather than principles, is carried out in the sestet of the sonnet, in which the dearest freshness deep down things is presided over by the brooding Holy Spirit, reminding obviously of a relation to Christ, suggesting a connection of the Spirit of God hovering over the chaos tohu vabohu in the act of creation, while also recalling those passages in Hebrew scripture of Yahweh as the brooding hen. This connection seems to be cemented when in the final line of the poem, Hopkins speaks of the covering wings. God's grandeur renders a poetry that is incarnationally saturated and possibly sacramentally saturated as well, while making sure that neither Christ nor the Holy Spirit, as creative and sustaining, are evacuated of the concrete personae and etherized into principles. I think I'll leave the Windhover sort of alone. It's a wonderful poem, but I think I'll leave it alone. Now, while Hopkins's focus on Christ's incarnation is central to his work, nonetheless, it is only one aspect of a complex oeuvre that overall is Eucharistic and involves the drama of loss and alienation from God as presupposition for resurrection. The Wreck of the Deutschland is a poem of apocalyptic terror. A ship carrying nuns, already in exile, goes down on the Devon coast. The insertion of the Eucharist into the poem occurs as early as line 2, where God is first recognizes the God who gives bread as well as breath. The question of the poem is, what responses this manifestation of the terrible, whether acceptance or rejection, blessing or curse, aversion or admiration, rings out of the whirlwind. The nun is the cipher of the suffering Christ, and because such, she is inlaid into Christ, and thus into his resurrection. She and the four other nuns all sort of are lost, or just before they're all lost, break out into the acclamation, "Let him Easter in us." This is stated just as the leading nun, in one of her last breath, has placed herself in the book of Revelation, the book of the Lamb, by citing its ending, Maranatha, come Christ, come quickly. Of course, it is open to the reader of Hopkins to take his or her point of view of Hopkins's poetry from the dark sonnets that brings down the curtain on the small oeuvre in which glory is to be found everywhere, in the meanest of things and moments, even in the darkness. On the surface, these poems seem to speak of the disappearance of God, of which Hillis Miller speaks and which Matthew Arnold dramatizes in the penultimate stanza of Dover Beach. The Sea of Fate was once too as the foe, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. The nightmare escape of the sonnet Carrying Comfort and 5 other sonnets that follow it seemed more like a winnowing and a test of belief than Arnold's nostalgia for the absence of God. Carrying Comfort seems to have both a test. The test is that of fighting, wrestling with God, and winnowing is that the purpose of the experience of God is that my chaff may fly. There is the now there beyond grief without the experience of the Comforter, who might give consolation, the loneliness that beyond imagining leads to a kind of decreation alonely began. And there is a pointing to a heaven sort of which has a baffling ban, and somehow or other a hidden God who has a deep decree and not available for inspection. A cry goes up for a God that might reveal himself in delicious kindness, yet hope irrationally continues to subsist, that joy might come in God's season in the right measure of size. The absence of God, the main point is, the absence of God can no more be taken for granted than God's presence. In the manifold of the priest Christian, who has appropriated his Christianity or being appropriated by it, everything is dramatic, everything is act. This applies to the nature and origin of Epiphany as it does to the experience of the absence of God, which is still religious because it speaks to a relation. In this instance, God's sovereign act of withdrawing that remains mysterious and that is granted a limited space it Ignatius exercises, but are front and center in St. John of the Cross. And this brings me to the other denizen of Newman House in the wake of Newman, James Joyce, perhaps the most famous man of letters that our small island produced and who largely succeeded in expropriating the English language from the conqueror by first writing it perfectly in the Imported of the Artist, deranging it in Ulysses, and rearranging it entirely in Finnegan's Wake. Here we focus only on the portrait, which is Joyce's Bildungsroman, in through which he became an artist, in through his struggle with Catholicism, whose control of our behavior, Irish behavior and minds, were ubiquitous, and whose legacy was self-hatred and guilt that depressed intellect, repressed imagination, and made human flourishing impossible. Throughout the novel, in his protagonist, Stephen Dedalus, Joyce shows his distaste for the clerical vanguard, horror at some of his figures, Father Dolan obviously, and contempt for the low ceiling of bourgeois expectation under which Catholicism and politics do their dance. Excoriation and exposure are inevitable in such an anti-Catholic text, which turns out to be so damning precisely because Joyce has, as his anti-hero, a character who speaks the language of Catholicism so well. Of course, if the effective takedown of the Catholic Church was all that was achieved, one might well wonder why the text enjoys such a high reputation. Yes, there is the perfection of the language and the great set pieces that feature at the beginning of language, the moo cow goes down the road, the hellfire sermon, the epiphany of the young woman on the beach, and also the use of a motto to mirror the motto of the Jesuits of silence, exile, and cunning that concludes the growing of the damaged and unhappy youth into an author, the demiurge of his own life, and a proprietor of words. Yet more, I would say, much more is going on than this. Stephen's semi-divine status, his role as mediator between the eternal and temporal, is given in his very name, and is enacted in and through his expropriation of this mediatorial function from the Catholic priesthood that seemed to have a monopoly on it. While the exercise of Catholic power can be raw and brutal, much of the power is soft and therefore, on Joyce's account, more insidious. It is embodied in litanies, sermons, the words of forgiveness, and above all, the entire ritual of the Eucharist, its pacing, its gestures, its cadences, and above all, the words of institution, "This is my body and this is my blood," wherein language generates its objective correlative. If we could say that Stephen adopts the role of prophet in protesting against the church's raw power, he liquidates the church by liquefying its soft power, by taking on the role of priest, whose words have sacramental power. That the power of language is derivative with respect to another helps with his elevation to the role of mediator, since priests, after all, are at best mouthpieces for Christ, who is the real agent of metamorphosis and of the transmutation of the invisible into, rather, the visible into the invisible. The artist emerging from chrysalis has come to recognize that at its best, Catholicism has been a code for a more general economy of sacrament, relevant to all of our physical and sensory reality, and each and every one of our experiences, whether sacred or profane. There's something of Prometheus about Joyce's Stephen. He is a thief who steals fire and gives it away to those other heroes of language who have been brave enough to empty heaven, sideline Christ, while taking on his obscurantist supporters and experientially bankrupt institutions. Joyce is preferred romantic in the text, maybe because of the license provided by transgression, is Byron. If the novel gives the unmistakable feel or whiff of Shelley in the muted recall of Prometheus Unbound, but more nearly of the manifesto for the artist laid out in Defense of Poetry, in which the poet is at once mediator, prophet, and priest, and the master presider over a language that is original rather than secondary or tertiary, alive rather than dead, a language that might create a community correlative to its creativity. Indeed, as the portrait leans towards its Bildungsroman conclusion, the portrait not only rebuts Catholicism, but leaves it drained of all authority and bereft of its linguistic power that now belongs to Joyce. Thus the question, and maybe a payoff from this journey through Newman towards criteria for Catholic ascription to an author's work. Does Joyce provide us with an example of Catholic imagination in the portrait, thereby setting up the prospect of Catholic ascription of his work as a whole? Of course, it would not grade out in the way that Hopkins's poetry grades out Catholically, but then very few pieces of literature are going to hit its level of Catholic supersaturation in image, metaphor, and even the experience of the dark night of God's absence. Now, if the novel were to be defined by the presence of Catholicism as a theme, then it's obvious the portrait is a Catholic text and an example of Catholic imagination. Yet this is precisely what Newman's amended definition does not allow. Catholic ascription is not based on theme, but on the perspective of the author, who is formed by Catholic symbols, metaphors, and shapes the world through them, sometimes comfortably, sometimes uncomfortably, sometimes in crisis, sometimes joyously, but always experimentally and searchingly. Joyce's Bildungsroman has the very determinate result that the prominent Catholic signifiers were always bereft of their corresponding signifieds. Happily, however, the arrival of the artist meant that the signifiers now signify properly in a secular world marked by power, struggle, sensation, desire, sex, and above all, flux. Catholicism is the world from which the secret has been wrong, that it is an illusion and was always talking about the world, or at the very least a form of transcendence that does not involve either a personal God or transcendent real or beauty. Beauty and reality are defined by here, and there is no essential difference between sacred and profane language, between different imaginative capacities, but only the difference between imaginative capacities and different levels of linguistic power. In this sense, the portrait represents a belated form of Romanticism that insisted on the divine power of human imagination. Indeed, if we think of Newman's sense of Protestantism as summed up in private judgment, then we might even say, however counterintuitively it may be, that the portrait is an exercise in Protestant imagination. I realize that this is a provocative conclusion, but it does follow from the criterion of Catholic literature that followed on a rereading of what Newman could have said, according to his own principles in the text that I quoted, and which, responding to the pressure of bishops, he was forced into the hyperbole of insisting that English literature was Protestant, and that the mingle of Catholic doctrine and literature proposed by the bishops was not literature. In my reconstruction, Newman's fundamental criterion of Catholic point of view in experimental form, conveyed dominantly in and through image, metaphor, and narrative. Having Catholicism as an explicit theme does not count. In addition, there may very well be cases that while the language evokes a Catholic perspective on the world, it does not perform it to a significant degree. Just as Hopkins's poetry would represent a supersaturated Catholic imagination, other texts and other authors represent an undersaturated but nonetheless real Catholic imagination. But these will be the liminal cases. One can imagine that there can be a correspondence between Romantic and Catholic inclinations, but only insofar as the Romantic element has not etiolated divine figures and elevated human beings to divine heights. And with this, I'm going to conclude. There are conditions under which Catholic literature can negotiate fruitfully with Romanticism, provided the following is the case. As long as God has not been killed, as long as Christ has not been deleted or depleted into a figure of the imagination, as long as Christianity is not simply a mythic code that has been cracked, and that we can thank the Romantics and those writers in the wake for finding the human correlatus for the signs that failed to signify. There is a Catholic literature. Newman was wrong. There is a Catholic literature. Newman was right. But there's only a Catholic literature with something like a criterion whereby we might be able to make up our mind as to what level of saturation are we talking about and whether it works, or whether in fact actually in the giving of Catholic signs, the signs and the meaning of those signs are in the process of being erased. Thank you very much.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions.
Judith, since
Thank you. Cyril, this is not a well formed question, but I'm hoping that you can help me. It seems to me, following after Joyce, people like Graham Greene or Evelyn Waugh, but particularly I'm thinking of Graham Greene, has a Catholic imagination in something like the sense in which the Greek tragedies feel that plot can only proceed by a particular metaphysical configuration of the world. So for Greene, plot comes from the strictures that Catholic moral imagination places on goodness and value. And the protagonists sort of are almost crushed by that, but their actions, often tragic actions, come from the strictures of the Catholic truth of the world, which is also, in a sense, tragic. Do you think that that's a species of Catholic imagination? That's presumably one of your limit cases, but is there anything you want to say about Green and Vaugh is really what I'm asking.
well, let's stick to Green. So it seems to me so that on this Newmanian analysis, Green is in. That is, that Green wants to and does not want to believe. Green finds himself in situations where belief sort of seems to be on offer, which he refuses, and other occasions in which it's impossible to refuse, precisely because it represents a limit to the ego. Just as he thinks it's impossible to be forgiven, except forgiveness gets offered, refused, and gets offered again. So it seems to me that while you could think about Green's novels as, there are these, shall we say, mountains of dogma sort of which crop up in an experience whereby it's offered as a prospect that you can't sort of quite comprehend, but a prospect that kind of bruises you in some particular way, arrests you, interferes with you. And part of the reason why I spent some time talking about the non-incarnational elements in Hopkins, whereby that he's able to bring those elements which seem, if you like, to be pulling the rug of an entire kind of Catholic imagination, so far as that's given an image, positively given in images and narratives and metaphor, and would seem that he's pulling the rug. And all he's doing, in fact, is making the rug more complex. That is, he's finding a place for a dark night in which you can only say, no, well, whatever I want to think about being something more than is the case here, that I am not experiencing this. What I'm experiencing is the question of it. I'm experiencing not so much my interrogation of it, because that would be skepticism. I'm experiencing that reality interrogating me. So I take, in some sense, that it seems fairly easy to me, unless I'm missing something. It's fairly easy to graft, I think, Green onto, a region of that supersaturation. And what he does, of course, is there is no singing, there is no incarnation, there is no kind of sacramental imagination, but there is an attestation of an irreparable loss, an irreparable counter to you, an irreparable call to you, which somehow or other spears and cuts what otherwise would be a secular imagination, and one's interest in writing, having a profession, getting along, and so forth, or simply behaving as ethically as you ought to, or trying not to behave as bad as you generally do. But I think much more is going on, than that. I think that there is this sort of intervention, this sense in which you're beckoned, you are affronted, but you are on the cusp of affirmation and negation, and neither one thing fully, nor the other. I would say. Could you move closer? Sure, will do.
Cyril, thank you. So much to say. But I hope you'll excuse a personal anecdote here. I was traveling in Scotland on a professorial vacation and stopped at Walter Scott's Abbotsford, which is Scott's home, this medieval manor that he recreated from scratch, including a chapel. And when we were there happened to be a newly ordained Scottish seminarian who was saying mass at the chapel, because in the generation after Scott, it was swept away with the Oxford movement, and Newman himself came and said Mass at Walter Scott's chapel. Which is to say, I think one of the things maybe we can, I want to go back to your diagnosis of Newman uncharacteristically making a mistake. Why did he make a mistake? And hastiness and pressure, certainly. But it seems to me maybe he didn't have confidence in what he himself said about the romantics he liked. So Wordsworth, Coleridge, Scott, Southey too, and didn't see that they could overcome the anti-Catholicism that he had diagnosed in the Protestant tradition that had shaped the literary tradition. So I guess I have maybe just an idea, and I'd like to hear what you think about it, Cyril. Is that in some ways Newman was the missing link himself to bring forward this kind of deeper sense of almost like Catholic romanticism that he was able to see in glimpses in Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, and Scott. And maybe he didn't know the answer, he didn't have hope in the answer because in some ways he was almost the answer himself.
Okay. Right. That's a very interesting question. The first point is a kind of clearing of my throat in some sense with respect to kind of giving an answer. And that is that at some level, certainly in the Apologia, Newman invites us to think about the peaceable kingdom in which Romanticism and Catholicism can exist. Right. So those references to Romanticism are fairly positive. We know that he has a somewhat troubled view of Coleridge, but it's not entirely a negative view. So in other words, for those sort of persons who think, look, Newman said some positive things about Romanticism, and of course, he points to Romanticism as at least half a cure, right, for skepticism and for materialism and this worldliness, right? So in that sense, you can negotiate. The question I think that he's asking about romanticism is, with whom and under what conditions? The reason why I talked in the way I did and the way I try to talk about that we move from Milton to the Romantics. And I think that access from, let's say, Milton to Wordsworth that's the dance of liberation of Romanticism from any form of religious belief. It just so happens that it was Protestant belief that was in the ascent. So Romanticism is, if you like, involved in self-designation as we have removed all allegiance. And where we have that gesture of self-affirmation of liberty and that religion is only a past. And then we have correlative to that, the way in which the religious imagination is self-verifying. That is not, shall we say, validated in and through its object. It's verified in and through. It's simply its own attestation. So what I think he calls for is a discrimination. Who are those authors, romantic and not necessarily making explicit inroads very much into anything like a kind of fundamental shaping of the world in and through belief and myth and image and so forth. But nonetheless, say something about the world that is congenial and it doesn't make impossible a conversation. My view, however, is that, and I spent more time on the negative aspect, is that romanticism as such more nearly functions as a displacement replacement, whereby you have an assertion of a religiosity that is non-confessional, that's potentially universal, though exceptional, and that then functions not merely as a partial answer to the materialism and the physicalism that bedevils modernity, but it's the only answer, and that those Enlightenment folks who criticized religion, they were right. They in turn, however, had to be criticized. So Romanticism without its absolute, shall we say, apotheosis and its displacement, of actual religion, that cannot be negotiated with because it's telling you it's not going to negotiate. And what I'm trying to say with respect to the portrait Joyce is telling you, I think we have to listen. He's telling you, I will not negotiate, I'm refusing. What the novel does is, it itself is an exercise in demythologization. He's demythologizing before you. The Bildungsroman is how, God help me, how I overcome Catholicism and how I overcame not so much fidelity, but fealty, right? Fealty sort of to something that's external to me because sort of it is a community, a group activity, which has supposedly a form of authority other than the authority that I can impose upon reality. So the text itself is Catholicism in the act of disappearance. It's Catholicism in the act of its own self-erasure. And I think we get, I mean, I'm Irish, so I want my guy to be a Catholic author. But it seems to me sort of that we should push. Are we just simply sentimental, or are we getting desperate? So I suppose this is really what I think that the renovated Newman is forcing on us. And I do think, actually, your question, I think, is not really indicative, but central in the form in which you made it. Because I do think that the narrower issue, as it turns out, is that because sort of the Catholic imagination, remember that the Catholic seems to be sort of the adjective qualifying the noun. Often, of course, it's not quite clear, not quite sure so what the qualification is worth. But it is imagination itself. That is a Protestant product. And we had to be very careful of colonizing it. That is, it's quite clear so that when we're talking about imagination or inspiration, about imagination in particular, and that's obviously sort of what Coleridge is going to systematize in Biographia, right? He borrows from Schelling, he cribs from Schelling, he plagiarizes sort of absolutely from Schelling. So we just simply had to convict him of that. So there's obviously no honors code, so there's no been exercised at that particular moment. But when he's sort of now metaphysically undergirding imagination as productive, he can say all he likes. It's the repetition sort of now in the finite mode, sort of an echo of sort of the infinite I am. But you're saying it's productive imagination. There is a absolute ambiguity between whether that's divine or not. So therefore, we've got sort of this displacement, and that ambiguity is structural and quite deliberate in my view. Now, that does not mean so the history of Coleridge after the Biographia is not a kind of different history. It's a somewhat different history, where I think so there's something is taken off of that particular claim. But he's making that claim in the context of, if you like, doing a literary history and making kind of, literary evaluations. So I think that's my point. But I think Romanticism, where it goes, will turn out to be the issue.
Thank you, Professor O'Regan. This has been excellent. Two quick questions. Well, maybe we'll see. The first one was posed to me 2 days ago after I gave a talk on Hopkins about whether you would consider inscape and in-stress as sort of downriver of maybe the illative sense. Is there any connection between those? I suspect there's some metaphysical underpinning of that would require an understanding. The second question, would you see Joyce as sort of an object lesson is what happens when you become untethered from a metaphysic or a god, such that if you look at the progression of his novels, Portrait of the Artist, Dubliner, Ulysses, Finnegan Wake, it becomes less and less intelligible, so that we're not talking about unique haeseity, the eachness that you see in Hopkins, which can be understood by others, but in fact becomes almost like a private language that is no longer understandable.
Right. So I'd say with respect to the first question, it's clear that Hopkins has a sense that the poet sees. It's not divine inspiration. It's seeing as a practice. It's seeing as a pedagogy. Referring back to last night, there is this kind of sense in which we start out not seeing that much. We start out seeing not that sharply, and eventually we do. Inscape and in-stress seem to me sort of on the other side of things. So clearly this learning to see is, I suppose, the way Newman might think about it, is a form of personation. That is, it's a way of becoming a person. But what you see, the quidditas or the thisness of things, is presumably sort of just that is a metaphysical comment about the nature of the world, a scriptistic comment about the nature of the world. That is, that particulars are there so to affront you and affright you and invite you. In stress, I think sort of is the way sort of in which we have to talk about all things, less as, even though there's a sense in which Hopkins talks about them as things, there's ways in which also that really they are bundles of energy. So in stress itself, I think, as that then sort of tends to be reflected in the language, is the assertion that sort of within any sort of one field of vision, there is an energy that is both sort of simultaneously an act of fusion and an act of fission, but an act sort of an act of act. I mean, so one of the things I think we'd have to do, I think, with Hopkins is to try and translate him sort of from the language of being into the language of act. But in stress then sort of also is the one and only means by which everything holds together. Everything holds together, like in stress is, everything holds together by stress. I mean, it's a stress of things, but it's also a stress across all those things. And all those things stressing and, if you like, stressing us out. So that would answer, I think, with respect to the first question. The second question, well, yes, I mean, I wanted to take what would look like the easy case for Joyce being a Catholic thinker, right? We got Eucharist all over the place, sacramental, we got language, we got litanies, we got music, everything looks like. If that's not a Catholic text, we're all in trouble. Well, we're all in trouble, but not because of that, it seems to me. That the text itself, right, is the deconstruction of the fact, but also the deconstruction of the possibility of the sacramental imagination. So, I think we just have to do a double take. It is not an example of the sacramental imagination. It's an example of the deconstruction of the sacramental imagination, which then gets sort of, to those texts which you mentioned later on. I did sort of, somewhat, facilely kind of introduce Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. But I think basically sort of your question sort of is really kind of more or less sort of where I was. When you think about the experimental modernist nature of Ulysses, what one sort of has to assume sort of at that particular point is that, right, signs. So we have signs, but do we have symbols? We have an organization sort of, of the text, let's say by myth. But is this a sense in which myth somehow or other functions as other than a kind of placeholder, a kind of catalog, for certain kinds of behavior or certain kind of happenstances? And in that sense, there isn't a signified operative. There's now sort of a set of signs, all of which sort of will point sort of to the immanent, are all generated within the immanent frame, and all will point to objects which themselves are immanent. Now, that those particular immanent objects are not static is another thing entirely, right? Now, he also has his view with respect to, whether things are going to hold up and whether they stay long enough so that, for us, and whether our experiences are coherent enough for us to render them and register them. But that's aside, I think, to the actual question. And I think if you're thinking about Finnegan's Wake sort of is no longer sort of, shall we say, simply that the signs do not refer to, let's say, signs are not symbolic. They're not sacramental. They're not incarnational. They do not render and give us the gift of reality. But Finnegan's Wake sort of is that, well, we're going to have a problem sort of with respect to signs and not simply the signifieds, in the sense that we don't really have a stable kind of set of signs because we can agglutinate language, right? There are, I believe, 70 or more than 70 languages. So on the one hand, Finnegan's Wake is set up as a kind of universal language or Esperanto. Right? That's one gesture which Joyce is not going to redeem. So we got a universal language which now sort of is melded into the Tower of Babel. That is, there is no one language. There is no universal language. There's only Babel of language, where sort of signs, where in words, or what words he's using, they cannot signify univocally because they're not even a word in any language. So all of that sort of goes by the board. Babel and universal language are the same thing. They're simply two different sides of the same coin. And that is, of course, then the far reaches of the consequences of when, in fact, words do not signify, when, in fact, they don't render reality. This sort of is where it's going to go. And in that respect, I mean, Umberto Eco, of course, is an interpreter of Joyce. And yeah, he says some very, very interesting things. And most of the things he says about Joyce seem to me to be true. I mean, he has his own particular interests. Has his own kind of semiotics. And Joyce, of course, so there's no parallels, the kind of medieval semiotics that he's going to enjoy, and not the one that he's not going to enjoy. But when he kind of is really, really does stipulate that the aesthetics, and I didn't talk about this here, the aesthetics, the Thomistic aesthetics of the text, which becomes sort of the object of exploration, but really parody, right? And displacement. In other words, if you're thinking about sort of a way in which that we've got sort of an Aristotelian Platonic way of talking about the world, in which sort of the transcendence sort of leaks in, and our language is relatively inadequate, but still sort of it gets there. And when Thomas is talking sort of about the appearance of beauty, and when that beauty sort of is a beauty sort of that somehow or other is more than the actual thing sort of which is the bearer sort of that particular beauty. Notice that in the portrait, that also sort of is undone. It's undone sort of by the stipulation. First of all, there is a kind of mistranslation that occurs, which points to the thing only as a thing, and the thing can signify other than itself. That in the sense that everything that would have been regarded as a given with respect to medieval aesthetic, which would account sort of for the appearance of that sort of which is not material, right? The rendering sort of indivisible of the invisible. That's countersigned. That is, it's already sort of now would be stipulated on the basis of the interpretation that it cannot do that. So it cannot do sort of what is built up. So what's happening is that Thomas, whatever Thomas said, and Thomas is not denied, but Thomas sort of is in fact, there is in fact a parody of Thomas whereby Thomas could never really have said what he said, and if he said what he said, it was entirely improper and misplaced. So all medieval aesthetic theory is gone, which leads then Umberto Eco to suggest that really the world that we have come into, the world that to some extent Joyce both prophesizes and is the exemplar of, is a world of chiosmos, not a world of cosmos. It's not a world sort of in which sort of you could even think so that there's any reference to anything beyond itself. It's self-enclosed. It's turbid. It's turbulent. It signifies, but can never grasp a signified. And that is the world. And therefore, the courage that we ought to have, the courage of the writer, the courage of Umberto Eco, writing The Name of the Rose, is the courage sort of to endure sort of in and through the way in which we have this systematic, absolutely irrevocable split between the sign and the signified.
With apologies to everyone in the queue, we have to wrap up, and thanks, Cyril.